이런 주제는 다루지 않습니다. 안 다뤘어요. 왜냐하면 여기 2017년 정도에 굉장히 핫했습니다. 그 전해에 대학 기술과 슈케 그런 단계를 중적으로 벌추도 컴퓨시라는 책이 나왔는데 거기서 소위 로봇 카르텔 모의를 촉발시켰고 한 1년간 모든 경쟁법 학회, 경쟁법 관련 컨설들도 기억나는 게 하나 있었습니다. 그래서 대체로 그때 얘기는 들어보면 되게 신박한데 기본적으로는 이거 약간 공상과학 같다라는 거예요. 그리고 실제 케이스는 굳이 끄집어낸 게 아마존의 퍼블릭 스피커 같은 포스터, 그 당시에는 실제로 작업을 하는데 마이크로소프트를 그냥 풀로 이용한 그 정도였습니다. 그런데 어느덧 8년이 지났습니다. 그래서 이제 이렇게 8년이 지난 현재 무엇이 바뀌었을까? 이제는 우리가 이거에 대해서 다시 생각해 볼 수 있는 기회가 온 것 같고요. 어떤 것을 우리가 그동안 배웠고, 어떻게 시장이 변하고 있고, 실제 어떻게 사건화되고 있는 건지에 대해서 헤이터 교수님의 이제 키워드를 통해서 이제 기본적인 어떻게 보면 그런 백그라운드는 다 들으실 것 같고요. 이제부터 거기에 기반해서 조금 더 자세하게 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 그래서 제가 먼저 우리 옆에 계시는 문재훈 국장님께 우리나라 관련된 그거를 좀 보시는데요. 작년에 이제 AI와 경쟁에 대해서 분석위원회가 보고서를 냈을 때 사실 이런 카르텔이나 가격 관련된 초점은 아니었고, 근데 이제 이 이슈가 공정거래위원회 입장에서 다시 뭔가 좀 중요한 정책이나 중요한 항목이 되었는지 아니면 여전히 조금 부차적인 그런 이슈인지 새로운 정보화에서 가이드라인 강화나 구조적인 부분에 대해서 어떤 식의 이제 뭔가 기생이라든지 그런 강조점을 주실지 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다.
네, 말씀해 주시는 기회를 주셔서 감사합니다. 말씀하신 대로 지난해 말에 생성형 인공지능과 경쟁 보고서를 발표한 바가 있습니다. 그 보고서에는 방법이라는 주제를 가지고 AI와 관련된 산업 분야에서 산업 분야의 현황과 그 분야별 시장 상황을 했고요. 그리고 또 그 AI 생성형 AI가 나타남에 따라서 경쟁과 소비자에게 어떤 영향을 미칠지 기업 결합이나 산업 결합 여러 가지 다양한 주제에 대해서 분석을 했습니다. 이렇게 방법이라는 주제에 대해서 작성하다 보니까 알고리즘을 이용하는 것도 많이라든가 이런 주제에 대해서 집중적으로 깊이 분석을 다루고 사실입니다. 하지만 저희가 또 생각을 해보면 경쟁 당국의 입장에서는 AI와 알고리즘의 이용이 시장에서 확산되고 있고 발전을 하고 또 여러 가지로 이용도가 또 확산되고 있어서 이 입장의 영향에 대해서 가격 감안이라든가 이런 프라이싱 문제에만 집중해서 볼 수 없는 상황이 분명히 있습니다. 그래서 여러 가지 가능한 상황에서 파악할 수 있는 법에 대해서 연구를 하고 법치 진행하고 그렇게 된 상황이 있어서 말씀하신 대로 저희가 가격 감안에 대해서는 알고리즘 프라이싱에 대해서는 조금 비준다 이런 거는 전혀 없고요. 저희가 그 패치 파악할 수 있는 사건이라든가 진행 상황에 따라서 저희가 그때 어떻게 지정을 하고 있다 이렇게 설명을 드릴 수 있고요. 그런 차원에서 간단하게나마 저희가 지난 몇 년간 공정거래에 대해서 진행을 한 알고리즘 관련 검증한 사례 두 가지만 설명을 드리면 먼저 검색 알고리즘을 이용해서 시장 지배력을 확산한 사례들이 한 두 가지가 있습니다. 하나는 네이버 사건이고요. 네이버 사건은 네이버는 쇼핑 검색 서비스를 제공하면서 동시에 스마트 스토어라는 오픈마켓을 같이 운영을 하고 있습니다. 그 과정에서 쇼핑 검색 기능을 이용하면서 누군가가 어떤 상품을 내가 사고 싶은데 가격이 얼마인지 비교를 하고 싶다고 가서 검색을 하는 게 아니고 검색 결과가 이렇게 리스트가 쭉 나오는데 그 리스트에서 네이버에서 운영하는 스마트 스토어에서 판매하는 상품을 상단에다가 수련돼도 그렇게 알고리즘을 조금 그렇게 바꾸고 그렇게 이용을 했습니다. 그래서 그런 방법으로 해서 원래는 검색 서비스에서 굉장히 시장 지배를 갖고 있었고 스마트 스토어 분야에서는 이렇게 지배력이 강하지 않는데 그런 식으로 알고리즘을 이용해서 하는 방식으로 해서 결과적으로는 스마트 스토어, 그러니까 오픈 마켓 분야에서도 시장 지배력을 확보하게 되는 그런 문제가 있었습니다. 저는 공정위가 보고 이만한 것으로 판단하고 조치를 했고요. 또 하나의 사례는 택시 서비스예요. 카카오 모빌리티라고 여러분도 많이 이용하실 텐데 카카오 모빌리티에서도 카카오 T 앱이라는 택시 호출 서비스를 운영을 하고 동시에 카카오 T 블루라고 해서 택시 가맹 여러 가지 택시 기사들이 가입하면서 서비스 제공하는 택시 가맹 서비스 같이 하고 있습니다. 그래서 이 경우에도 카카오 T 앱에서 택시를 부르면 호출하는 서비스에서 카카오 T 블루에 가입한 택시 기사들이 더 유리하게 그런 알고리즘을 이용하는 방법입니다. 택시 호출 시장에서의 지배력을 택시 프랜차이즈 시장, 가맹 시장으로 확산하는 그런 사례에 대해서도 저희가 공정원을 진행한 사례가 있는 점을 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다.
제가 이어서 대만의 안티체인 공정교육위원 부위원장에게 질문을 하나 드리겠습니다. And I'm aware that the TFPC commissioned a series of empirical studies on algorithmic pricing in the past few years, which has gotten a lot of national recognition as well. Could you share some of the core insights that came out of that, and you've heard what the TFPC is thinking about security related to algorithmic pricing, what is TFPC doing in that as well?
Thank you, thank you for the floor. It's great to be back. I was here last year, and the weather is lovely this year, especially in comparison to Spain. The TFPC over the past 3 years, the TFPC has commissioned a series of empirical studies on algorithmic pricing. The initiative was driven by the white paper of competition policy digital economy, which we issued in 2022. And according to the white paper, we recommended the TFPC to follow an issue-driven and empirically grounded approach while reviewing digital cases. So against this backdrop, that's the reason why we commissioned several research projects to researchers to better understand the current situation of algorithmic pricing practice in Taiwan. So I'm going to share the most recent research with all of you. The first one is on the commodity market. The researcher collected the price data from the upstream and downstream markets of soybean, flour, milk, wheat, and other commodity markets. The purpose is to find out whether the algorithmic pricing is commonly practiced in Taiwan, and if yes, whether they are conducive to price solution. So, despite that, the researcher found out that by using machine learning, he might consider the conclusion, and they also has discovered there are some abnormal price fluctuation in some commodity markets such as milk and in the flour market, but still they did not find any indication of price solution through the algorithmic pricing practice. Then the second research shift to digital economy. We commissioned this research project to two economists and one mathematician from local university in Taiwan. And the research result was recognized by the Commons. It's the best sophomore study in the Asia and Oceania category this year. The researcher collected price data in 3 computer-related products and 1 daily necessity market for study and comparison. And the findings were quite nuanced. We found that the price fluctuation is quite relevant in the computer products market, but quite stable at the daily necessity product market. And daily necessity actually is toilet paper market. So the research examined for different types of computer products. The reason for picking up the computer products is because the product are highly homogeneous and they are standardized. And especially because marketing has experienced frequent price fluctuations, so they would make the data required for training machine much easier and more accessible than any other products. So based on the research, they found out that the product market, the computer product market, the price fluctuation is quite relevant. And they also showed a sign that the leader follow model, that is the leader firm, each time with the leading firm make a price adjustment, the rivals will follow immediately. So that might be the implication of using algorithmic pricing mechanism. But there are 2 candidates to this research project. The first one is that the researcher found out that the price adjustment, the frequency of the price adjustment in the market were actually quite low. They are 2 to 3 times per day. I think that's far below the benchmark in several international studies on the same topic. So the conjecture made by the researcher is that probably in Taiwan, the computer product market supplier adopt a hybrid of algorithmic as well as non-algorithmic pricing model in the market. In addition, the researcher also find out that unlike Amazon, the e-commerce platform in Taiwan did not use the price, the buy loss or the repricer tools, which make the price comparison easier. So probably that's the reason why they did not find out the even though algorithmic pricing is likely, they did not find out any conclusion. The third one is the researcher explored the advanced method of detecting conclusion. So the researcher used big data, machine learning to detect whether the algorithmic pricing is commonly adopted and whether they are conducive to price conclusion. While there, they did not find any evidence showing the conclusion. However, they did find that what they call the wave traffic is that the topic, the term that frequently discussed in the media has a correlation with the price decision. So this is just going to get that in the future, the wave traffic might serve as an indication of early warning of conclusion. And also the finding also indicate that machine learning is more effective in detecting price conclusion than regression analysis, because machine learning follow a nonlinear methodology to detect pattern, while regression analysis is more linear. So this suggests the TFTC by spending more resources on data collection and labeling data in the future. So I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Just one quick clarification about price fluctuations. The markets that the TFTC studied, were they concentrated or were they non-concentrated? How could you just share the market structure just briefly?
I think the 2 of the research projects focused on what we call the daily necessity, the big the chunk, the bulk commodity markets, and that market is quite competitive. Yeah, but computer products depends on the types of the mainframe and the chip. They are different, but I think the results is still the same. Currently, there is no sign of algorithmic pricing.
아시아의 나라에 대해서 들어보셨는데요. 이제 유럽으로 한번 가볼게요. Ambassador, question for you. So in the EU, my understanding is that you basically have a categorical approach to regulating algorithm. So you have, on the one hand, algorithm facilitated agreements, and then the second basket is the collective, where you might take coordinated adoption of a pricing tool. And the third basket would be independent and non-coordinated adoption of a pricing tool. And it seems that try to treat these three baskets differently. Is that correct? And what are your thoughts on that as to the second?
Yeah, first of all, at the outset, I should say that at this moment, there has been no decision or judgment on algorithmic pricing or the use of algorithms, for example, for close competitors yet. And then, as for the categorical approach, under Article 111, yes, there is a categorical approach. So there is a restriction by object and by effect dichotomy. That is the equivalent of the per se rule and rule of reason under German Act, Section 1. And yeah, I focus on three scenarios to which, at this moment, Article 101 could apply. And I excluded the scenario that Professor Harrington referred to, which is the tacit solution scenario. So, like many other competition rules, Article 101 at this moment cannot apply to tacit solution outside perhaps measure control. So the three scenarios that I focus on are the most obvious one, that would be the hub and spoke scenario, which Ariel Draghi and Stucky referred to as well as the second scenario. And this is perhaps the most obvious one, where the harm is most obvious. And to this scenario, there's almost no doubt that the restriction by object applies to, because there is inherent harm to competition. So there's clearly an intent by competitors to collude, and they're using vertical agreements with a third party, the third party acting as the hub. However, these vertical agreements are merely a sham for a horizontal agreement. And under EU competition at the moment, not only is this treated as a restriction by object, but it's also treated as a hardcore restraint. And the presumption that comes to the hardcore restraint is not only is there no revealing factor, but also the possibility of getting an exception under Article 113, which distinguishes Article 101 from Section 1 of the Sherman Act. So even though there is a possibility to get an exception for hardcore restraints, there is presumption that any exception will be unsuccessful. We do, while we don't have an actual case dealing with an hub-and-spoke price fixing agreement using AI, at this moment we can use the Apple ebook case as an analogy or as a guidance for how we should treat an hub-and-spoke agreement under EU law. The second scenario is where a single buyer, a single firm uses a third-party algorithm, and this one is a vertical agreement. But we should say that this is not a conventional vertical agreement, given that most vertical agreements recognized under Article 101 deal with restricting intra-brand competition in order to strengthen perhaps inter-brand competition. So the classical vertical restraints that are prohibited and severely prohibited are research price maintenance and certain distribution agreements, such as export bans. So with regard to vertical agreements, there is the idea that vertical agreements are not as harmful as horizontal ones. However, under Article 1.1, as I just said, certain vertical agreements are treated as a restriction by object, such as reserve rights maintenance and export bans. Now the question is, how should we treat a vertical agreement involving a third-party pricing element? Given that in this case, it's not about the distribution of goods or service, it's about one firm supplying the other firm with data or outsourcing its pricing decision to a third party. Nonetheless, given the potential for potential of pro-competitive effect, as mentioned by Professor Harrington, the pro-competitive effects of price discrimination, for example, we should treat these types of restraints as a restriction by effect. And indeed, if we look at legislation, then it seems as if the European Commission would treat such cases on a case-by-case basis. That is confirmed also in the horizontal cooperation guidelines, but also in the vertical blocking center regulation. And then we come to the interesting scenario here, where multiple buyers use the same third-party pricing algorithm, but where there is no agreement amongst the buyers or the sellers. And in this case, yeah, given that there is no agreement between the buyers, the only sort of remedy that we have is to treat it as a stacking of several vertical agreements, where we look at the cumulative effect of the various agreements, and possibly here again, the vertical agreements could have a horizontal effect. A scenario that maybe resembles this scenario is the use of most favored nation clauses, which we had a few years ago with hotel online bookings. And there the Commission refrained from treating it as a restriction by object. Instead, it's being treated as a restriction by effect. But the Commission also emphasized that it looks at the cumulative effect of those restraints. So it does pay attention to how many of those contracts are in a given market, and also pays attention to who are the sellers. So, for instance, the size of the sellers will be then decided. So, for instance, if an online platform is involved, that would make a difference as to whether, as to the involvement of a smaller firm using a third-party pricing method.
이제 마지막으로 국가로서는 일본을 다루고 그다음에 좀 더 토론을 한번 진행해보겠습니다. Any thoughts about Pastor's intervention on the category treatment from Japanese law perspective? And also, the JD's recently updated its guidance on antitrust compliance, which should include reference to algorithm pricing. Could you briefly share your thoughts on those 2 points?
Yes, thank you. Compared to the EU, so by the way, this is a framework that they created by the JDC study group on AI in 2021. And this is, as you mentioned, that there is a RASPA, this is self-driving algorithm. There will be no violation. Then the 2B so without agreement, as Professor Harrington was described, it's extremely difficult to regulate that. And there's a category that whole category was carved out from the regulation. So it is now 4 years old. So then back then, I was a part of the study group. And back then, our understanding was that it is almost like science fiction, as you said. genuinely self-running algorithm leading to corrosive license won't happen. But then we have learned more, we have more knowledge about that possibility. But then the problem is that it's this framework is not only based upon the understanding, but also Japanese law. So we have to do this one. So this is a Japanese legal basis. So not only the but there is a slight difference from the agreement and the what is required under the Japanese constitution law. Very similar to the US German Constitution 1, but the difference between agreement and what's required under the Japanese law. But second, we need to JPC needs to establish agreement. So that's first. And second, this section, this provision only covers horizontal agreement. Then there's another provision that covers vertical agreement or vertical relationship, which is either private mobilization or 12 for which the JPC is an agreement is not vertical agreement is not enough. You have to establish a controlling activities or some restriction over some like about labor, manufacturers, or platformers, put the bar of condition. So only saying that this user is doing this, this company's algorithm for AI is not enough. So for that reason, JPC Japan has been having a hard time. Even today, they haven't solved that. So for that reason, I think it is, well, I may wish that Japan could regulate their pollution like EU approach. But it is very difficult. I mean, that amendment is necessary to do that. So what is happening now is that, but at least you see this is like no area, but there's some like collaborative facilitated by AI. So for that, JPC, I will say by through that mentioned that program survey and giving recommendation to the EC. This is, as I said, more consensus based, but also like gradual approach. You don't, JPC, Japanese government won't find a company like out of blue. You first get delivered reports, guidances, alerts, recommendations, and the alert. So this is, I guess, this is the part that this gradual process will get there.
이제 뭔가 좀 더 실제적인 토론의 함이 앞서서 와쿠이 교수님께서 말씀하신 것에서 한 가지 뽑아내서 규제장에 계신 분께 짧게 좀 여쭤보겠습니다. 2016년에 버추얼 컴피티션의 어떻게 보면 가장 눈에 띄고 화제가 되었던 포인트는 이제 와쿠이 교수께서 말씀하시는 마지막 서비스 고리에 자율적으로 가격 결정을 하는 소위 인공지능이 나타나면 공정거래법이나 전 세계 경쟁법이 요구하는 합의 요건이 무력화되고 그거를 사실 해결해 줄지도 모른다. 이런 게 굉장히 어떻게 보면 약간 충격으로 이제 이렇게 얘기를 했고, 근데 이제 와쿠이 교수 말씀하신 이거는 부상과학이 아니기 때문에 일단 넘어가는데, 근데 9년이 지난 오늘 아직도 합의 요건은 그대로 좀 가지고 있는 게 그런 제도냐 견제하는 게 맞는지 아니면 이제는 띄어졌는지 두 공유자 얘기한 것처럼 좀 다시 생각해봐야 되는 그런 상황인지 먼저 국장님께 짧게 좀 거기에 대해서 생각을 여쭤보고 그 다음에 아니 얘기로
어려운 질문을 먼저 답하겠습니다. 그냥 어려운 질문입니다. 그리고 그게 되게 어려운 이유는 제가 볼 때는 AI나 아니면 계속 발전하고 있고 또 이게 언제 어떤 식으로 얼마나 영리하게 발전할지 사실은 지금 정확히 예측하거나 알기 어렵다. 미리 선제적으로 어떤 제도를 만드는 게 상당히 어려운 일이어서 이거는 아직도 고민이 좀 있고 많은 경제가 그렇게 생각하고 있고 주기적으로 기본적으로 다시 생각을 해야 되는 그런 주제가 아닌가 생각합니다.
And so remember first competition. Everybody after that the talk was at the time, oh, we should do away with the agreement provider. That's the stumbling block to regulate pricing algorithms and robot agreements. Do you think that's now correct 9 years down the road, or do you think still the agreement requirement is necessary, it's fundamental, and should still stick with that?
I think that in this case of timeline, you're simply probably more conventional framework for analyzing even equity prices currently. So we think the conventional antitrust framework, such as early agreement from indirect or circumstantial evidence, could still work in prosecuting equity prices as long as you have solid evidence. And as long as you have very consistent and clear evidence. So the TFTC has lost a number of cases about the continual case based on inference of indirect evidence, simply because the court cannot come up with a consistent evidential rule. Because in practice, when you are dealing with this issue regarding the further agreement, most parties could present quite convincing evidence, and they could propose very convincing arguments for the court to accept their positions. So we need a clear standard to say which one is right. So I think at least in Taiwan, I think this is current state of the right now.
So building on that, Joe, I want to go back to and thank you for patiently waiting for so long. So the question is, building on what was just mentioned from different jurisdictions, related to this issue, do we need new laws? Do we need new evidentiary standards, or just better enforcement?
Well, I think the answer to that, and we can get a sense of that from the presentation so far, is it really depends on how algorithms are being used. And it's been noted that if the firms are just coordinating pricing algorithms as opposed to prices that really fall under the competition laws of per se or biotech defense. And so that's handled. Well, I'll make a side comment. When we go back to think about 9 years ago, what as we learned and what is surprising, in my mind, what's surprising is the lack of cases where firms coordinate pricing algorithms. Going back to 2016, when the Ezrachi and Soup book was produced, there was a case, as you mentioned, pursued by DOJ and the UK Competition Authority against sellers of posters online. That was all about coordinating pricing algorithms. To my knowledge, that's the only case. Now, maybe it's because all these other companies learned the lesson from that case. I'm skeptical. Or it could be that we do need to engage more enforcement, more detection. So that's someplace the law's in fine shape, but we have to be a little bit concerned there are cases out there we have to discover. Going on the other extreme in terms of to what extent the competition law is in good shape. As already been mentioned, mentioned about self-learning algorithms, that is not a violation of competition law. Competition law is built upon agreement, mutual understanding. And there's none of that if these firms independently adopted self-learning algorithms, which have learned how to improve. And we certainly know from the evidence in simulated environments that's very easy to produce. More common than not, it's a fairly robust phenomenon. It has not been observed in actual markets, but it's going to take a different approach to respond to that. It may not be an antitrust approach, it may be a regulatory approach that restrict pricing algorithms. So those are challenged, But, when I compare that to the challenge of task exclusion, you take the kind of canonical case of one gas station raises its price, hoping the other one across the street infers that an invitation to both set a high price, and they accept that invitation by matching that price against themselves. We know that's harmful, but it's lawful. And it's lawful because there's no remedy. There's nothing you can tell the parties that would not interfere with the competitive process. Self-learning algorithms is like that, in that there's no communication, there's no agreement, no understanding, but yet getting harmed. The right side to it is that there may still be a remedy, and the remedy would be restricting prices out. And the last point I was just making, going back to the third-party pricing algorithms, where there things are most interesting. You probably need new laws and new evidentiary standards. New laws, obviously, mentioned the whole issue of unilateral conduct by a third party may create harm that may be able to be treated as a concerted practice under EU law. So an open question. I don't think you can do much under US law. But I think new laws are needed there. I think what's really interesting is the one that came up in the discussion about, suppose there's, what does it take in terms of common awareness about that? That is, this is like a hub and spoke cartel. The hub is that supplier of a pricing algorithm. But it's different from the usual hub and spoke cartel in that the input is not some commodity. This is a production, it's actually a price. And just the fact that a single entity is providing prices to competitors is already undermining one of the most fundamental principles of competition, which is that there's independent pricing. And in fact, that's what we often, as part of making the case that there's an unlawful agreement, and to do so with circumstantial evidence, we want to establish that, for example, those prices that we observe could not be the product of independent conduct. It had to be coordinated. So, for example, all firms raise prices by 50%. You can say that, well, that's not going to be in the interest of a firm to do so unless it anticipated other firms would do so, and thereby getting coordinated conduct. So here, I think the issue is that we probably want to put more of a burden on the third party than we would typically do so. And the reason why is that the third party engaging with competitors, and nothing more, no agreement, is already undermining the independence of the price setting. And so maybe we really want to put the burden on third party subscribing firms to convince us that the prices are not important, rather than requiring plaintiffs or the competition authority to convince the courts that the prices are harmful.
Last I want to ask you to sort of comment on what Joe just said about especially the evidentiary standards and the patent sort of pollution, and also the independent, you might say, adoption of a algorithm. And I think you did explain how it would be treated under EU law. What's your point of view, or what do you think is the right evidentiary standard for such conduct? Should be more to a per se approach, or should we, remain, as we said, more to an effective approach?
Yeah. So as I said before, even under Article 101, even restricted by object could, in theory, be exempted by under Article 113. So there's a difference to US law. Nonetheless, due to the presumption that come with a categorization as a restriction by object, and we should be careful to categorize new restrictions as a restriction by object. And indeed, since that one here, we again have more of a restrictive interpretation of the restriction by object category. And furthermore, since the Budapest Bank case, we need sufficient and consistent experience and evidence of the inherently harmful nature of a type of agreement before we can categorize it as a restriction by object. So, given all of that, and given the potential pro-competitive effects of pricing algorithms, I think categorizing the use of pricing algorithms generally, except for the very hardcore case of a scenario, should be treated as a restricted by effect. And that would actually shift the burden then to the defendant. So it would shift the burden to the buyers, but also to the third party. And as Professor Harrington said, Professor Harrington spoke about the evidentiary, shifting the evidentiary burden to the third party. But not only should we shift that burden to the third party, but we should also ask then the third party to show us or show that the pro-competitive effects outweigh the anti-competitive effects. So I do think that the restriction by effect is the right category, but that there should be more of a guidance as to or more of a similar as in the US antitrust with the rule of reason and the quick note that it might be that certain instances it's easier to establish a restriction by effect than in other cases, and that the burden shifting should become easier under the competition.
And I want to ask a question about an issue that Joe raised about interdependent price issues. Generally, when there was parallel pricing, we said interdependent pricing, and then the plus factors kicked in, and then we would try to find a solution. The real assumption, underlying assumption, was that the market structure was oligopolistic, or at least it was concentrated. Last slide had 5 parties. It could easily be 10, right? So now, are we rethink plus factors? Are we now to say, oh, we don't care about market structure? We don't care. So in fact, it doesn't have to be independent as long as it's a third party outcome that everybody independently adopts. We're going to go for tacit position.
First, I would like to point out first that similar to Japan, Congress conclusion is also issue about cartel prohibition on the Taiwan Fair Trade Act, because the cartel prohibition related to horizontal prohibition. So if you use the hub and spoke, outsourcing the ever was party, as long as the third party is not a competitor, you cannot prosecute this kind of case. So that's the reason why we have revised the law. We have engaged in proposing a draft for the Congress to incorporate this kind of provision into the cartel prohibition. And we mentioned a very good question and also very difficult question. How can we infer agreement from either the structural factors or behavioral factors? I think that's the debate since we have antitrust, especially in the United States. And yes, it may serve for us to start the inference, but I understand all. I will mention one case, this other algorithmic solution, but I indicated that market structure is just a starting point. We still need to look at it into the reality of the market. So we have a self-reference solution, self-reference case by Google. They place the search on the Google map at the top of the search page. In that case, Google has large market shares, but the DMA is still looking into other factors, whether, especially on the demand side, whether consumers are actually constrained by Google. And we found out that actually not, because the consumer still has the other alternative to use other search engine or to post or to better the hyperlink in their bookmark to avoid being plugged in by Google. So in addition to market structure, we other various factors or realities in order to determine whether it is really a market power.
I'm going to ask a question to all of the panelists and related to the remedy. So there's been a lot of talk about liability and when to find a solution. As Joe pointed out, though, the remedies are the real problem. And I'm going to start with you, Masato, and then maybe others can comment. So I think there's sort of a general understanding in the panel that if you just sort of draw an hub and spoke type of conduct structure, and there's a third party, then even if there's independent adoption or not, then you start thinking about, well, is this a hub and spoke and have a solution. But then what does the third party have to do to avoid then liability? Right? Because under competition law, the hub would also be liable in that case. At one point, does it say, oh, I only have 4 customers, sorry, I'm going to refuse to sell it to you? Does it have to say, oh, at a starting point that, okay, I'm not going to train my model anymore with your data, or from now on, I can't use your data or that data? So what does the third party have to do to avoid control? What would competition law require third parties to do?
My idea. Complicated, not answering to your question. The part of my answer is that what is the prompt should be maximized from there, and that should be promoted to maximize from it plus bias benefit. So what about that? Fine.
Joe, do you have anything you want to add regarding remedies? What Masato just said?
Yes, I didn't hear the last part of it. Could you go back to that?
More complicated, more realistic answer is that, well, it's more like a question. I mean, what was said to me here in your presentation is that, why this one industry has one price tag, and then whereas other competitors with pricing algorithm providers in this sector. So that is whether there are no competition. So my guess is that now our current discussion is based on this pricing fixed pricing algorithm operator provider has a lot of data, not only what competitors doing, but also like the market structure, consumers or buyers, those are the use those data. Then they are doing very good job. Then users go to the same company. So that is that necessary to be that way? Any possibility for us to have multiple pricing operators? Then if you have more than one, then you are very.
Yes, so, yeah, I guess you have to put this into more of a regulatory solution if that doesn't naturally. Now, I should say, to begin with, in these markets, there's, the ones that are familiar with it, there's very few data-less companies that's actually supplying the price algorithm in a particular market. Like, for example, in apartments, the real page had more than 80% of the market. And there's, I think that's going to be a pretty persistent feature, partly for the reasons you described about all the advantages for data. If one third party gets a lot of the data, a lot of subscribing firms, it's going to be hard for them to come in and be as access. So I think we're going to deal with market dominance here. And so now the issue is, what do we kind of require of that? We can sort of start thinking about them trying to silo the data, which is, so this is what the US is right now pursuing, is that it's saying that it cannot use non-public competitor data. So silo that. You could have them, make sure to, just have separate units in the third party actually designed to be in charge of designing the pricing algorithm. So in principle, you could create independent pricing within the third party. So that's something that could potentially, be done. It's, the question is, I mean, that's getting pretty interventionist, but that might be good to go. I also wonder whether something can be done, and it goes back to on your slide about common awareness, whether there should be some prohibition on the third party advertising who is it that's subscribing to my service. Now, in the typical type of marketing, you would expect to see that. You want to convince customer A to buy your product. You tell them, well, look at all these other customers who have bought it. And I have testimonials to say, they get value from it. But here, there's the concern that it's providing that mutual understanding that, well, if I subscribe, I'm getting price recommendations from this third party, and I know from the third party that all my competitors are also subscribing. I give me a level of confidence to actually implement the recommendation that I receive. So maybe we want to, basically say that if you start informing other firms, forming a firm as to who else is subscribing, well, that's circumstantial evidence supporting you trying to advocate.
예. 아까 제가 답변드린 좀 말씀드렸죠. 저희의 합의가 계속 필요하느냐, 어느 점에 대해서 지금 사실은 굉장히 경제적인 응원에 대한 제가 이번 프로그램을 준비하면서 지금 그런 방향을 현재 우리가 갖고 있는 하겠어요. 알고리즘을 이용하는 가격 감압에 대해서 주제를 해요. 어떤 점이 좀 달라지고 어떤 점을 고려해야 되는 것이냐 하냐면 일단 저희 법에서 간단하게 보면 우리사의 사고가 있어야 되고 그다음에 가격 결정 규칙입니다. 합의가 있어요. 이 경쟁에 대한 그런 조건을 해야 돼요. 보면 이제까지는 우리사의 사업자라고 했을 때 이제까지 경쟁 사업자가 참여하는 경우가 대부분이었어요. 하지만 알고리즘 아까 허브리스 소분이 이런 걸 사람이 왔을 때 경쟁자가 아닌 사람과 같이 합의하는 경우도 우리가 많이 하나가 있고 또 가격의 결정된 경우 그 자체에서 합의하는 경우에 대해서 우리가 주로 법칙을 많이 했지만 그 자체에 대한 합의는 없지만 합의 다른 뜻의 합의했지만 그 결과로서 가격의 결정 변경이 되는 경우에 대한 법칙도 많이 일어나는 것이라는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 그다음에 의사의 연락에서 여러 가지 경험들을 했는데 거기에 대해서도 또 알고리즘을 어떻게 중간에 변경을 했는지 그리고 제3자 대한 알고리즘 서비스 제공한 제3자가 자기 서비스 홍보하거나 광고하는데 어떤 식으로 거래 상대방에게 소개했는지 저희 서비스 이용하는 비슷하게 했습니다. 저희 서비스 이용하는 대부분의 서비스 비슷한 정도로 하게 되니까 이건 어떤 방법으로 파악하는 것이고요. 경쟁에 대한 성으로 관련해서도 하나 알고리즘을 이용했을 때 많은 정보의 교환이 발생을 하는데 이제까지는 경쟁에 대한 포함을 하지 않을 것이라고 생각되는 정보들이 과거의 정보, 횟수가 적은 정보 이런 것들이지만 그렇게 해서 경쟁에 대한 포함을 하지 않을 거라고 생각했던 정보들을 교환해서도 알고리즘에 의해서 경쟁에 대한 효과가 발생하는 경우가 합니다. 그래서 이런 여러 가지 질문을 했을 때 다른 경쟁 전 세계 다른 경쟁자들도 지금 현재 있는 법을 가지고 어떻게 알고리즘을 이용하는 법에 대해서 대응할 것인가가 중요한 문제이거든요. 거기는 스스로 공정거래에 대해서도 지금 공정거래 조정원을 합의를 해서 알고리즘과 담합에 대한 정부 노력을 진행하는 그리고 그것이 전 세계적으로 경쟁 가격이 진행하는 상황과 연관상통하고 있다는 생각하고 있습니다.
그 특정을 사용해서 지금 2분 남았는데 30초 동안 마술을 발휘하고 있습니다. 오늘 이제 패널 토론을 하고 난 뒤에 이거에 대해서 좀 들어가야 되는지 이렇게 부분이 뭔지를 좀 부탁드리면서 마치려고 하는데요. So 30 seconds each with the final 2 minutes that we have. Following today's discussion on the panel, what do you think are the most important points that we should focus on going ahead in the next couple of years at least with the agentic AI coming with developments that we are seeing right now? Joe, maybe we could start with you.
Certainly, now I do research on third-party pricing algorithms, so I feel really that's important. But it is the one that's right now, it's a clear and present danger sense that's creating harm. So I think developing units there is the greatest urgency. And then I think really on the self-learning algorithms, as I said, that's not a reality in markets. But if it does become reality, we're kind of defenseless against it. And so I think we have to it's well established that it can occur in the lab, and a lot more work going on there. We need to start thinking about possible that it actually migrates from after market.
Bhaskar?
Yeah, I agree with Joe that with regard to third-party price algorithms, there might be a market failure, and there might therefore be reasons why we should introduce regulation. So perhaps the market for third-party pricing algorithms might be monopolized by one company, and then due to network effects and first mover advantage. So if that's the case, and we want to introduce more competition in that market, we can follow that. I think there is no other way than to introduce regulation. Another issue that we should pay attention to as well is what if big platforms use not third party algorithms, but their own pricing algorithms, and where a significant part of the market is then affected by pricing algorithms.
Masako?
I'm able to see observation studies more. Politically, I'd like to know how president, when we talk about pollution, I think we are still thinking of it like one product, one price across the market. But is it still older after 5 years all personalized pricing differentiated? So that's what I like to continue on devoting.
And okay, from a legal perspective, I just mentioned we have a proposed draft in law trying to incorporate legislation that can accommodate the habits of pollution. And other than that, the current law should be applicable to detecting and prosecuting aggravated pollution. We also have an exemption article in our law, which would allow aggravated strategy to apply for exemption if they are really efficient and negative. And from an economic perspective, I think that there are three words: data. Because I just mentioned that based on our white paper, we are going to continue to follow the issue-driven and empirical grounded approach, which can lead to the rule of reason approach. So probably we need to more quantitative to facilitate our labeling of data and to train machine learning in order to detect its earlier trust pollution from the heuristic prices. pollution happens without it. 자, 마지막 하나만 드리고,
생각에는 요즘 프라이싱이나 AI나 이게 빨리 발전하고 있기 때문에 경쟁이 나는 시장에서 AI나 어떻게 활용되고 이렇게 올려지고 어떤 상황인지 정확하게 지속적으로 모니터링하고 그걸 파악하는지 가장 중요하다고 생각합니다. 거기에 따라서 우리가 분석하고 그런 노력을 계속하는 것이 가장 중요하다고 생각합니다.
그 장시간 시험 토론을 진행을 했는데요. 마지막으로 모든 패널리스트에게 박수로 감사의 기도하겠습니다.
네, 어느덧 본 행사의 마지막 세션입니다.